I'm at Tyndale University College at the RAVI Zacharias Summer School, and I'm so thrilled to have Ravi Zacharias himself with me today. Welcome, Ravi.
Thank you, Kerry. Good to be with you.
It is great to be with you, and I think like many people, I've heard a lot of your addresses, read some of your books, and apologetics and evangelism is such a big subject. And I think for a lot of us, we think, oh, I have to have all this knowledge, and I don't think I'll ever measure up, and I won't be able to defend my faith. But where I want to start today is one of the things I've seen you do incredibly well is in your stories when you're speaking and in your writing, you often talk about conversations you have with people. And one of the things I've seen is that often, you know, when you're walking out to your car one night after a talk, when people start asking you questions, you'll ask them questions back. And you'll ask people of different religions questions back. So you answer a question with a question. Is that something you do regularly? And tell me why you do it.
Yes, I do. And going back to your preamble, Kerry, in terms of the intimidation of knowledge and all of that, you know, A.W. Tozer, when he came to the church here in Toronto, it was interesting. His assistant used to be my first boss when I went into ministry, Bill Newell.
Really?
And Bill Newell told me when he was sitting next to A.W. Tozer with a high, sophisticated group of people that were there at the welcoming dinner, said he looked around and he looked at Dr. Tozer and he said, you know, Dr. Tozer, I really feel out of place here with all these highly qualified people. And he said, Tozer leaned over and said, Bill, we're all ignorant, only in different subjects. And I think that's the reality. We can't all be specialists, but we need to know where to go to search for answers, especially if somebody is asking us those hard questions. Now, as to the main part of your question, questioning the questioner, I didn't come up with this on my own. I looked at how Jesus was dealing with this subject. Whenever anybody asked him a question, good master, what should I do to attain eternal life? Now, you and I typically would say, wow, this is the question I've been waiting for from you for so long. Let's sit down and in 5 minutes we draw some pictures and ask him which picture identifies his life and what the answer is. Jesus looked at him and said, why do you call me good? There's none good but God. And what Jesus is really doing is opening up this man within his assumptions and determining the entry point of the discussion. Those are two very critical facts in dialogue. You've got to open the person up within their own assumptions. That's why even C.S. Lewis talked about the fact that nothing is so self-defeating as a question that has not been thought through before it has been fully posed. So what Jesus is saying to this man is, are you calling me God? Or are you saying it's possible to be good without God? And if you're calling me God, are you going to listen to my answer? And if you're saying it's possible to be good without God, where did you arrive at that from? So it brings the point of the questioner very quickly into focus in what they assume. So when people talk to me, for example, they say, what's wrong with such and such? I'll say, you know, it'll really help me if you can first tell me, is anything wrong with anything? Is there a moral wrongness to anything in your life? That then allows me to understand where they are coming from, how they make their judgments, and whether they are willing to give that prerogative to the other person as well. That's the important thing. So yes, questioning the questioner, that's the first reason. But there's a second reason to this, Gary, and that is behind every question is a questioner. If a person is raising the problem of pain and evil, and I learned this early in the ministry, I can still remember it vividly. I was in Birmingham, Alabama. It was the late 70s. I just started out. And there was a couple that I was talking to, and they were raising the question of the problem of pain and suffering. I was about to go into my answer when I noticed in the pew behind them was their baby. And one look at that child and I knew there were serious deformities in that birth. It suddenly gave me pause that I better recognize this question is not just a philosophical one, it's a felt need. So both in terms of the existential reality and in terms of the assumptions, it's important to question the questioner.
That there's always a reason for the question. And I think often in apologetics, we would tend to think it's academic, like the problem of suffering. Well, you're asking me the theodicy. Nobody's been able to solve that in 2,000 years. How am I going to solve it? But really, the question might be, why did this happen to my baby?
Yeah, that exactly. And how do I cope with this? What possible answer could God have for me in the midst of all of this? And I always look at Mary herself standing in front of the cross, watching Jesus being crucified. I think it was Jeremiah Denton, one of the former senators in the United States, saying her face showed grief but not despair. And even though she had questions, she had faith to spare. And he goes on in that poetry to raise the struggle of what must have been going on in her heart. I think of the verse that Simeon gave to her when the baby was to be born, "Woman, a sword is going to pierce through your heart." And I wonder if that came back. So in the thick of pain and suffering, even if you know there is one who has the answer, it still is a journey, one step at a time, before you look at it from the other side of reality.
So I think one of the things so many of us, myself included, appreciate about your ministry is incredibly well thought out arguments. I mean, that sometimes take really years to refine. But for the average Christian who's sitting there going, I've read 1 or 2 books, I've listened to a couple of podcasts, how can questions be a gateway into a conversation with their friends? Where would they start?
One of the great unfortunate realities of my own journey in faith is people think of me as an intellectual. I'm really not.
Okay.
I really am not, Kerry. I wish I were. It would be nice to hide behind some sophisticated degrees and so on. I just ask a lot of questions myself. And when you're reading heavily, you are listening to other responses to the same issues. And like G.K. Chesterton, I would say, you become a polyglot. You're able to take different people's perspectives and put it together into a composite. And ultimately, I'm convinced that answers are not just theoretical. Answers are also relational. Let me give you an example. A little baby, or say a 1-year-old, going into a doctor's office and is in the arms of his mother, and says, my mother wouldn't take me anywhere to inflict any pain, so I don't know where this place is, but I'm going to go. Then all of a sudden he sees this big needle coming and he's going to get jabbed. What is his answer at that point? His answer is, I have no clue why this is being done to me. All I know is I'm with my mother. And even when she takes him back again, he's going to be even more mystified. It takes many, many years, and he says, now I have the answer to this. A lot of our answers actually are born out of a relationship before they become propositional answers. And I think that's a very important clue to our journey in faith and in truth. So when I journey through these ideas myself and work them through, today as I go across the globe, we have packed audiences wherever we go, and what is encouraging to me is they are trusting you as the speaker to be able to minister to them and bring the bridge between the head and the heart. I don't take this privilege lightly. I take it very seriously, and it's very intimidating and fearsome, but it's a privilege God gives and has to be honored with your life and with your trust in Him.
One of the privileges you have is to see what's happening around the world, and you've also seen that over the course of really 4 decades of ministry now. I think all of us would probably agree that the culture in the West has shifted dramatically in North America. What changes in evangelism and approaches to evangelism have you seen over the last 4 decades in our culture?
The cultures globally have changed, Kerry. That's what I see. China, India, the Middle East. But the interesting thing to me is those who have come from a backdrop of naturalism or secularism or anti-theism, like China, or Romania, where I was just a few weeks ago. The audience that night was 10,000 strong. You couldn't get them into the building. And then the next day I was meeting at the what they call the People's House, which was Ceausescu's home, 2 million square feet, the second largest building in the world after the Pentagon. And the senators and all were sitting there listening, and one of them said, when I finish, this is the first time God has been mentioned in this building here. This is the first time a prayer has been prayed. Wow. Now, such hostile anti-theism took place. But in the West, what has happened is we've come from the bequest of the Judeo-Christian worldview. Yeah, the ethics that we followed, whether we like it or not, came from that worldview. And we are jettisoning that worldview and think we can still hold on to ethics. China wants American speakers to come because they recognize, or North American, I should say, American, Canadian, or even for that matter, English speakers, because they know they are living off the capital of the Judeo-Christian framework.
Yes.
And they want to see that ethic. And in atheism, they did not have it. So those parts of the world are going through change. Then you go to the Middle East. My colleague in Alexandria tells me, for the first time, atheism is on the rise in Egypt because they have seen what their religion has done to their young. And they say, if this is what it is all about, we don't want it. So the young are asking questions of the worldview that has preceded. And I think the changes are taking place here. We become very naturalistic and anti-theistic, and therefore the change is quite staggering in our time.
So it's almost a pendulum swing in opposite directions based on the previous generation. And so you're seeing almost an inverse thing happening in the formerly communist countries or godless countries, where people have a hunger for God, and where God was actually a part of the culture, people are rejecting it.
Yes, and I believe we will learn the hard way that this is a mistake in the West. Why was the West so successful? Why did we all come here? I mean, I came to Canada when I was 20 years old. I got off the plane, it used to be called Malton at that point, you know, it's Pearson Airport now. Rented a room near Eglinton and Yonge, you know, paid $8 a week. My brother paid $8 a week. We were $16. We were in one room, sharing 2 beds, so on, starting off our young lives here. It was a different world in Canada then.
Yes, it was.
And when I came here, I saw the ethic, I saw the values. What is going on in some parts of the East? Systemic corruption. If you ask any Indian young man today, what is India's greatest strength? He'll say intellectual ability, science, engineering, all this stuff. You say, what is the greatest weakness? They'll say corruption. All the corruption that goes on. In Hindi, they say mej ke niche, under the table. The under the table deals that are done. What happened to ethical systems of thought? It didn't generate real ethics. But when you have a personal relationship with God and you know there's accountability, you have an ethical value or norm that is part and parcel of society. We're losing that here now. But once upon a time, it was very much here in North America. So I think those are the changes that we're going to start feeling down the journey as we go.
I think you get a lot of resonance with what you just said, and I think there are many people who are almost despondent over what we see happening in the West. So let me flip it a little bit as we wrap up. Is there anything in the West right now with these cultural changes that give you hope? Like, do you see a little crack in the door with a bit of light coming through, or does it feel more bleak than that to you?
You know, the wheat and the tares are growing side by side. If I were to listen to some of the academics and what they're instructing the young, then I say to myself, my word, where are we going with all of this? The total skepticism, the relativism that is endemic in the academic world. But then I look at young people who come to the meetings. I remember one young gal in Cornell saying to me, she walked forward and she said to me to talk, she said, most of my life I am living with naturalistic assumptions and the scientific worldview. You are here talking about a supernatural dimension to life. And she started crying. How do I make this paradigm shift? What reasons can I find to make the paradigm shift? I said, why are you asking? She said, because the other road is a dead-end road. She said, I have no meaning. I have no basis of value judgments. She said, I'm emptier than I've ever been before. And so what I say to you, Carrie, no matter what university campus we go to, or what business setting we're talking, or what political arena we're in, the place is packed. So it gives me hope that people are searching, and any time the young are searching, there's hope for the future. And not only are they 18, 19, 20, 22, 23-year-olds, they're 14 and 15-year-olds. I get letters from 12-year-olds. When I go and speak in audiences, there are 12, 13, 14-year-olds who bring one of my books and say, can you sign this for me? I'm so profoundly moved by that.
That is moving.
Yeah. So I think there is hope. Anytime you see a young audience that's eagerly listening, it takes one person to change the world, you know, and it can be done, and I have that kind of hope. After all, when we believe in God and know the gospel story, how can we be hopeless? We know God is sovereign. He's not caught by surprise. And He is the one who moves the heart of a king. And I believe in time things will change. Right now, it looks pretty bleak.
I want to tackle one or two of the difficult problems today, the ones that even for me as a preacher, you come back to and you preach on the problem of evil, and you've given it your best shot for 40 minutes, and people line up and go, so how do you respond to a God who allows evil? And you're kind of like, I just spent 40 minutes on that. But that's you're writing about that again now, and the whole problem of suffering and
that
evil.
has happened. In fact, I was doing that in Washington some time ago, and when I finished, somebody raised the question, and a friend of mine came to me and said, were they listening to what you said? But let me give a personal word.
Please do.
It's a real delight and honor to be in Toronto, and this is my alma mater. I graduated out of Tyndale during the time of Alexander the Great. It goes back a long way in the 70s, but it's just wonderful to be here. I met my wife in Toronto. She's Canadian and so on. So there were a lot of nostalgia here. On the problem of evil, problem of suffering. In my latest book, which I have co-authored with my colleague from Oxford, Vince Vitale, it's called Why Suffering. We interchange on chapters, and he has some brilliant perspectives. His PhD work at Oxford University was on this theme. But in my opening chapter, I present what they call the trilemma. A secular philosopher describes it this way. So the Christians believe God is all-powerful.
Yes.
The Christians believe God is all-loving. The Christians know there is suffering. This is a trilemma because it is incongruous. How can an all-powerful and an all-loving God sit back and watch such evil and suffering going on? So he calls it a trilemma. Or sometimes they call it the evidential argument against the existence of God, that this is evidence for non-theism or atheism.
Right.
I respond very quickly by saying, why is it a trilemma? Why is it not a quadlemma or a quadrilemma or a quintilemma? Because it's also true that God is all-wise. We don't end our theology with God is all-powerful, all-loving, and evil exists. We also believe God is all-wise. And we further believe that God is eternal. You bring just those two elements into the equation, and it changes the paradigm. If God is all-wise, as you and I have talked before and talked about a baby going in to get an injection and so on, the baby knows that the mother is all-knowing over against what the baby faces. We know God is all-knowing. And then you take the issue of time. What happens over a period of time? Let me give you a quick example of this. When I was growing up in India, I was a constant failure, repeated failure, because I never applied myself. And then all of a sudden I passed in very high honors and the ability to join the Indian Air Force. Out of 300, they were going to select 10. I came in at number 3 on all of the theoretical and physical endurance tests, okay? I was an athlete and so on. So I phoned home and told my dad and mom, I'm in. I'm number 3. The only thing left is a psychological test tomorrow, and then I'll be coming back by train overnight, looking forward to being back home. I was so excited. So I sit down in front of this Churchillian-looking wing commander, and he stares at me across the table, and he's asking me a few questions, and then he leans over, and in Hindi he says, Beta. Beta means son. He said, Beta, you're a good man, you're a nice man, but I'm going to reject you. Just like that. And I visibly felt my body start to tremble. I said, you are rejecting me. He said, yes. I said, can I ask you, sir, why? I was on the verge of saying, I've placed number 3. Why? But I didn't say that. I said, why? He said, this job is about killing, and psychologically you are not equipped to kill. And jokingly, I always say, for a moment, I almost wished I could have proved him wrong right then and there.
In that moment.
Better part of wisdom is a big guy. I knew I'd come out second best in that too. I went back by train that night, came back the next morning. My friends and family are waiting at the station in Delhi with garlands and flowers to congratulate me. They didn't know what had happened.
Man.
Now, it was a few months after that the opportunity came to migrate to Canada. Roland Michener, who one time became the Governor General in Canada, prior to that was the ambassador from Canada to India, was a friend of my dad's, and opened the door for us to come here, and we came here. You know what, Kerry? If I'd been accepted into the Indian Air Force, I was committing for about 20 years. I would never have come here. Never would have had the time to sense the call for God into ministry. Never would have seen the life that God has now given to me to be a persuader and help people understand the beauty of the gospel message. That door was slammed. It took years to find out wide that door was slammed.
And now you say, thank God that door was slammed.
Absolutely.
But so is part of that then, Ravi, this idea that we just assume when things don't work out our way that God isn't good? Is that part of the equation?
It's a convergence of spokes into a hub. So let me put it this way. Even to raise the question of evil and suffering assumes there is good. Mm-hmm. If you assume there is good, you assume a moral law. If you assume a moral law, you must assume a moral lawgiver. But that's whom they're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no such thing as good. If there's no good, there's no such thing as evil. If there's no such thing as evil, what happens to the question? The question disappears without the reality of God. So logically, too, we must have to struggle with the question. Now, somebody might say to me, why do we need a moral lawgiver in order to have a moral law?
That was my next question, because didn't Kant try to prove that with the universal maxim?
Exactly, he did. And Iris Murdoch of Oxford University, in her book, The Sovereignty of Good, has a tremendous comment on that when she said Kant has this ability to think that we can somehow turn away from Jesus himself and find what is good. She said Kant didn't come up with that. There was an incarnation of that long before. His name is Lucifer. You know, this is a philosopher at Oxford saying this. Now, here's the answer to Kant.
Yes.
No. Because every time the question of suffering is raised, it is either raised by a person or about a person, which means the question assumes intrinsic worth for personhood.
That would be true. Yeah.
And you cannot assume that without a theistic framework. That's why Kant also, in a sense, he was a churchman, you know, he was not an anti-theist, he was not an atheist, he just believed that ethics, practical...
Maybe we could find ethics apart from God.
That's right.
Right? Which was sort of his life quest. So the way I hear that popularly expressed, though, because this is a fascinating conversation, and one that I think almost everybody has at some level or another, is, well, I don't need God to become a good person. I mean, I just agree that, you know, you shouldn't kill people, you should probably be a good friend, generally you shouldn't lie. I mean, I hear that not quite every day, but almost every day. I don't really need a God for that, and if we all just did that, the world would be a better place.
Yeah, theoretically that is true, but the answers of goodness then come from self-referencing judgment. I determine what is good. I decide what is good. Am I willing to give that prerogative to my neighbor too? Am I willing to give that prerogative to the person who stands in front of a television camera and lops off another person's head, supposedly doing good? How do we arrive at an objective standard if I am only going to do it apart from a transcendent objective worldview? So that's an immediate problem, but there's a greater problem than that. This is true only of the Christian faith, Kerry, and if the listener is hearing me, I want to say this very clearly. In every other worldview, you find a way of being good and find a way of not being bad. But in the Christian message, the reality is this: Jesus Christ didn't come into this world to make bad people good. He came into this world to make dead people live.
Yes.
That's the reality. It is not that we will be good and therefore we will see God. It is the fact that I cannot ultimately attain salvation by lifting myself up by my own ethical bootstraps. Every other worldview is good versus bad. If you ask a Hindu, for example, he'll say my karma. If you ask a Muslim, my good deeds have to outweigh my bad deeds. You come to the message of Jesus Christ, and it is grace and mercy and forgiveness. That's why even in the Old Testament, you don't get the 10 Commandments until you first get redemption. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, therefore you shall have no other gods before me. Redemption always precedes righteousness, and then redemption and righteousness precede worship. That's the sequence.
And I think even with subjectivism, you end up in the place where you fall short of your own subjective moral standards, and hence the need for some kind of salvation.
I think so. Which of us will deny that? You know, you set your own ground rules and say, I never ever came up to that. So there's a logical problem, there's an existential problem, and ultimately there's a theological problem. And this is why goodness has a long reach into our lives. And I often say pain and suffering are God's megaphone, as C.S. Lewis said. One quick illustration. There's a young gal outside Atlanta, Georgia, Ashlyn Blocker, I think is her name. She was born with a strange disease. It's called CIPA, congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis. She can't feel pain. Wow. And you may say, boy, that's wonderful. If she steps on a nail, she doesn't feel it? No, she doesn't. But the problem with that is, therefore, she doesn't know she's been cut and bleeding, and it could be infected. Her mother on television said, my prayer every night for my daughter is, please let my daughter feel pain.
Wow.
So if pain is an indicator physically in this world to something being wrong, how much more in the infinite wisdom of God can it be an indicator that what is wrong is our relationship with Him?
Do you think, because this is a question, and I mean, people will look forward to reading your book, which is soon to be released, but this is a question that has plagued theologians, people, the human race for thousands of years. Is there an emotionally satisfying answer? I mean, I know that's a very reductionistic question, but I think sometimes we hear all the arguments and we go, yeah, but my mom died. Or, yes, but you should see my brother suffering in palliative care. Or, you don't know how much my daughter suffers.
You know, you have to compare answers. You go to any other worldview, there are no answers. If you're a karmic thing, you know, you're paying for your previous wrongdoing.
Right.
The Islamic world hardly has any books on this subject matter because it's inshallah, it's the will of God. It's only in the Christian worldview where you have hymn writers, where you have poets, where you have expositions on this theme, where you have Jeremiah crying out, or you have Hosea crying out, wanting to know why they are suffering, why this pain, why this struggle, and so on. There are emotionally satisfying answers as time goes by. I've lived with a lot of pain with a broken back. I have 2 titanium rods that are about 8 inches long, 4 clamps, 8 screws bolting me down. I injured my back very badly. There were times I'd be sitting in the front seat of the car pulling over my head on my steering wheel and crying. The pain was so intense. And you know what I've found? How much it has taught me to depend on Him every day to sustain me. There are 2 things I need with this lifestyle: a strong back and strong vocal cords, and I have neither. And God has shown me that in my weakness has manifested His strength, and how His healing hand even came through on my back after years and years of suffering. There is an emotional satisfaction when I know that there is a cross, there is a hill called Calvary, there is a suffering Savior, there is a relationship where He gives me comfort. As Annie Johnston Flint said, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. He added affliction, He addeth His mercy. To multiplied trials, His multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, His grace has no measure, His power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of His infinite riches in Jesus, He giveth and giveth again. Here was a woman who was orphaned early in life, was incontinent, was blind, suffering from cancer. Cushions lying beneath her body for months and months of pain, sores from head to toe. And it was the biography is called The Making of the Beautiful. She wrote that hymn. There was emotional fulfillment in the intimacy of her life with her Savior. And I believe there is, but it's a path along which you walk and find out God does not conquer in spite of the dark mystery of evil. He conquers through it. He conquers through evil and pain and suffering and makes you the person He intended you to be through that.
You know, sometimes I think you're right. You know, we're looking for an answer when what we really need is a person. And that is the person of Christ, which God has provided.
Yes. Right.
Thank you so much, Ravi. This has been such a privilege to be able to sit with you today. And I think you've probably spoken to a lot of people's hearts. And I can imagine there's quite a few of us who are suffering right now. And you might be suffering at this point, going, I was looking for an answer, but really what I need and what I have is a Heavenly Father who knows and who suffered Himself in Jesus. And, you know, I think one of the things that we also have is the gift of Christian community, which I know you are such an active part of and a leader of. And you're not alone. And so we actually have people who would love to pray with you today. And if you would like to simply give this number a call, there will be people who will pray with you through your pain, who will cry with you through your pain, and who will encourage you through your pain, because Christ hasn't left us alone. So why don't you call that number right now if that's you. And Ravi, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back.